Okay. Okay, I'm going to start now. Welcome, everyone. Hope you had a good, refreshing break over the holidays. My name is Pallavi Swaranjali. It's a cold Saturday evening here in Ottawa. It's around minus 20. So what better way to spend the evening than have a stimulating conversation? So we are back with the rest of our webinars from our series titled Mindful Modernisms. We have had 4 webinars in the November of 2021, and today's webinar is the 5th in the series and is called The Use and Abuse of Mindfulness, featuring 2 distinguished speakers, Gregory Burgess and Ronald Purser. My colleague Kurt will introduce them shortly. A warm welcome to Ron and Greg. Mindful Modernisms is a 8 webinar series, and it's a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary discussion, which has been organized by academic initiatives of the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats in collaboration with the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College and the Department of Interior Design at University of Manitoba for the promotion of critical, mindful, and contemplative approaches in design thinking, education, and practice. Mindful Modernisms will consist of 8 webinar sessions, each with 2 distinguished speakers in dialogue around modern and mindful themes. The speakers come to these sessions from a range of design and non-design backgrounds, including interior design, architecture, mindful and contemplative studies, art and design history, graphic design and representation, gender studies, psychology, and sociology. The series is supported by the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and Interior Designers of Canada, and partially funded by the Ontario Association of Architects and a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We want to thank each of our generous sponsors, our presenters, and numerous students and research assistants and volunteers who work tirelessly behind the scenes, in particular, Megan Faninower, Cameron Collins, and Ali Zamani. This series is co-curated by Kurt Esperson-Peters, Roger Kona, and myself. Kurt is here with me. Roger could not join as he's traveling. Mindful Modernism is part of an ongoing series of webinars, publications, studio and seminar courses, and exhibitions organized by the academic initiatives of the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. So I would like to now invite Kurt to introduce our speakers and moderators and moderate the session. Kurt is an assistant professor in the Department of Interior Design in the Faculty of Architecture at University of Manitoba. And he's also the co-director of academic initiatives along with myself at the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. So over to you, Kurt.
Thank you, Pallavi. And I'd just like to introduce Pallavi as well. Pallavi is a full-time faculty member of the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College in Ottawa. And she has a bachelor's degree in architecture, a master's of design and industrial design from India, and a doctorate in architecture from Carleton University. And she is presently an intern architect with the Ontario Association of Architects, and her research centers on the relationship between architecture, storytelling, looking at non-conventional modes of architectural expression, that combine the normative and the fantastical, and the ways in which they meaningfully transform architectural making and experience. And her areas of teaching include residential and corporate studio, senior project foundations of design, as well as history and theory of design. She's also a coordinator of the Carleton Research Practice of Teaching and Collaborative, and one of the founding members of the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. So thank you, Pallavi, for being here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our fifth Mindful Modernism session today, entitled Use and Abuse of Mindfulness. And we're very fortunate to have two distinguished speakers here today, Gregory Burgess and Ron Purser. So I'd just like to introduce them both before we start. Since 1972, Greg has been the principal designer for Gregory Burgess Architects, with an emphasis on architecture as a social, healing, and ecological art. His international reputation has been established through a body of work including housing, community, cultural and indigenous, educational, health, religious, commercial, exhibition design, and urban design projects. He has been the recipient of numerous awards and taught and lectured at many Australian and international universities, and his work has been exhibited at major galleries and museums worldwide. Greg has been widely published in books and journals, including the most international architectural journals. So please join me in welcoming Greg to our discussion. Ron Purser is the Lamb Larsen Distinguished Research Professor of Management at San Francisco State University. He is the author of 8 books, including McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality, the Handbook of Ethical Foundations of Mindfulness, and the Handbook of Mindfulness, Culture, Context, and Social Engagement. He writes for such media outlets as Tricycle, The Guardian, Salon, Alternet, Tikkun, Pando Daily, and Transformation. And he is also the host of the Mindful Cranks podcast. So please join me in welcoming Ron to our discussion today. So our discussion today is entitled The Use and Abuse of Mindfulness. And the descent of modernism into aestheticism parallels mindfulness's collapse into the self-soothing marketplace. Both have fallen from their original intentions into parody and commodity. How have the concepts of mindfulness and modernism come to be used and abused? Are there aspects of modernism and mindfulness worthy of redemption and resurrection? Moving beyond McMindfulness and McModernism, Ron Purser and Greg Burgess reframe the agenda of a mindful modernism and a modern mindfulness by revisiting the self's relationship with space. By building a dialectic centered on consciousness, collectiveness, community, and culture, the discussion walks backward into the future, seeking either the liberation of the modern mind or liberation from the modern mind. So that is the session prompt today. And today we will have Greg presenting his take on our use and abuse of mindfulness, followed by Ron. So both will do a presentation, and then afterwards they will have a dialogue and discussion. And then after that, we will have opportunities to take questions as well. So during the session, if you have a question, just drop it into the chat and we will get to it at an appropriate time. And then we'll also have time at the end to answer any questions should anyone have it. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Greg. Greg, would you like to begin?
Thanks, Kurt, and thanks, Pallavi, and good day, Ron. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be able to reflect on, it's actually 50 years this year that I've had a private practice, and so it's quite a timely time to be looking back. I've recently sold my studio building, and I've been working with the Melbourne University and the Robin Boyd Foundation to move my archive of around 500 models and similar number of drawings to a new home. Robin Boyd was a legendary Australian modernist architect, writer, and sharp-witted social and cultural commentator. So it's been pretty helpful for me to look back over my life and archive through the modernist mindful lens. So I've got a bit of some images to support me here. I'll go. Looking back over my archive I feel my work resonates with what Colin St. John Wilson calls the other tradition of modernism. This other tradition streams out of Hugo Herring's vision of architecture as living organism, rather than the international style, that first stage of modernism defined by Le Corbusier's machine for living. Herring, Hans Scharoun, Sigurd Leverance, Alvar Aalto, Gunnar Asplund, Rema Pietila were all concerned in varying degrees with a humanizing architecture, creating impure collisions of motifs, fusing together modernity and folk tradition. In this stream, there was also a sense of a living past and a living future, and responsiveness to context and climate, to the desires of inhabitants, and a bold figurative power, qualities that the mainstream of modernism sacrificed to a reductive abstract aesthetic characterized by boxes and suitcase planning, celebrating technology in glass and steel. As I'm a practitioner rather than a theorist or an academic, my reflection on the themes will briefly recall a few defining experiences and projects. These involved a threshold to be crossed, some uncertainty to be faced. They demanded that I turn towards new challenges and opportunities, engaging with what was around me. This could be a definition of modernity: to live a more conscious and creative life, to listen for the emerging future, as Otto Scharmer, the Presencing Institute of MIT, describes it. We need to do this for ourselves, for our buildings, our organizations, and the earth. I've long been conscious of the weaving together of my personal life and my calling as an architect, and how they impact on each other. To develop more conscious presence, to refuse the path of absencing, we need to reflect on our biographical patterns and story, and be aware of the fears, doubts, and judgments that get in the way. We all have our versions of the threshold moments I'm recalling here. Without the burden of all their cultural associations, the words mindful and modern are still relevant and useful, but I did have an urge to recast them. I am here now. I listen, awake, present, and responsive to whom and to what is around me. I am open to transform, to let go and let come what is needed, to shape and be shaped in the right moment. Our buildings become ourselves. I strive to carry these qualities in my work and life. Of course, this is an ongoing challenge, and one which is easier to achieve in work than in other areas of life, I've found. Being present is ongoing and daily work. I grew up in Newcastle in New South Wales, in a modest Californian bungalow, where I had my first brush with modernism without really understanding what was going on. In the early 1950s, my parents decided the house needed modernizing. This meant a fairly radical makeover, mainly enthusiastic subtraction in the spirit of less is more. The removal of sun shading canopies, LED lighting, anything that connected it with the clutter of past style, which in their eyes dated it. Simplified, clean lines, taking down the front fence to share the front garden with the street. These were small but self-empowering acts for my parents of becoming part of the future, breaking away from the austerity and conservatism of their parents' generation to create their own look. The basic aesthetics of modernism had reached Australia. A slatted fernery on the south side was given a reprieve, probably because it was a cool and enchanting in-between space, timeless in its delight and functional beauty. Going back years later, the house had been made over again with a knife-edged A-frame sitting astride our remnant. Houses, cities, ourselves are all embodied with a restless impulse to grow, to become something else, with more or less mindfulness or consciousness. In my final year design thesis at Melbourne University, we were directed to assume the demolition of 50 acres of Carlton, an inner suburb of elaborate Victorian houses and workers' cottages, now heritage listed. We were required to design a 20-story residential tower, emphasizing technology, aesthetics, and composition, rather than human social considerations. I disagreed with this approach because I could see both the wisdom of the relatively high density possible with the prevalent terrace housing, and also its intimate human scale and coherent urban form and sociability. I developed a strategy to renew the service lane system at the rear of the existing housing with muse-like development, increasing the density but maintaining the fine grain. I was threatened with failing if I continued with this line of thinking. I backed down, but with my tongue in my cheek, developed a modular system that could be anything from 1 story to 20 stories. An early exercise in political compromise and a way to keep positive and creative in a repressive situation. This brutal example showed dramatically and tragically the powerful influence of the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier's multi-storied tower block proposal for Paris, and the champion of his work by the teachers and students in architecture across the globe. These were the 20th century decades of the hero architect. It also coincided with a so-called slum clearance policy for this area that had been adopted here in Melbourne by the Housing Commission of the time, literally demolishing the 19th century cottages and terraces to build a series of 20-story precast towers. A fellow student, Tony Stein Brown, was also resentful at our inability to follow a rejuvenation strategy. He submitted a beautiful balsa wood model of his tower with an exquisitely carved fist punching through the plaza-like forecourt. This was a clever push back and send up of Corb's signature open hand gesture at Chandigarh and elsewhere. The symbolism of the open hand seemed a contradiction of his dictatorial ambitions. Curiously, a few years later, along with some other architects, I was invited by the Ministry of Housing to design some low-income, low-rise housing in this same area in an attempt to rebrand the ministry more sympathetically with the changed political and social climate. At 26, 1 year out of uni, I started my own practice. 7 years later, my friend, postmodern architect, teacher, and theatre designer, the late Peter Corrigan, suggested to a group of architects, including me, that we hold an exhibition of our work at an art gallery, the first local architectural exhibition for many years. I felt vulnerable and underconfident about going public. I was enduring a series of difficult personal crises. After years of suffering schizophrenia, my brother had suicided. A long-term relationship had ended, and I was filled with existential angst. After 7 years of private practice at 33, I hadn't yet developed a strong sense of the worth or the meaning in my work, nor a strong sense of self. Nonetheless, my inner voice said yes to this call to join the exhibition. We wanted to share our work with the world, to provoke a conversation. During this period of crisis, an ex-priest and therapist I was seeing invited me to work with him as a healer. I didn't accept his offer, but it was a catalyst to bring my inner life and into play with my expanded vision of architecture as an ecological and healing art, recognizing soul and spirit dimensions. Leading up to the exhibition, I felt stuck and anxious, in need of a creative laxative. In an attempt to penetrate what I had been doing, I decided to write down everything I could think of that mattered to me, what I felt, my questions, my doubts and hopes, uncertainty about the future. This process seemed to unlock something. It reopened my heart, mind, and will to renewed purpose and direction. In a spare room upstairs at the gallery, I laid out my writing in concentric circles so people could walk around them and read the pages. Some commentators criticized this display as overly personal, but I am sure that the art of life and the art of architecture belong together, nurturing each other. This was an important fulcrum in my work, in my personal life, and my calling as a particular kind of architect. I feel my serious work began with then. I emerged from that experience with a deeper capacity for connection, empathy, care, and courage, so I could better meet the challenges of later community projects, particularly with Indigenous communities. While this exhibition was still showing, I was invited to give my first public lecture at the University of Melbourne, which I called Towards an Architecture of Wholeness. It became a reflection of my intent to bring personal life and vocation together, to be awake, present, and available to the potential of opportunities. A short quote from this talk introduces issues which I continue to explore 40 years later. It's a quote. As architects, it seems important, it seems vital that we realize our full potential as human beings to allow the possibility of our work to transcend its purely physical function and aesthetic preoccupations, to heal, delight, and move the spirit, amuse, enthuse, and calm the soul, to make a contribution to the evolution of human consciousness. At this time, I explored these ideas through the Kabbalah, the tree of life, the geometry of the snowflake and the rose, in a Japanese competition that I'd entered for a meditation chapel. Such explorations require flexibility, a dancing dynamic presence. The dance may begin in a room in an outer suburb, in a circle of Catholic seminarians, alight with their visions and aspirations. They plan to relocate their theological college to the inner city for the 21st century, a new building embracing old buildings, to celebrate and support their Christian values as they inform education, human development, and social justice, engaging with the culture of the city. Their aspiration was for the old and the new to dance together with the spirit and with the senses, to rebalance the feminine and the masculine, to renew the spirit of inclusiveness, tolerance and transparency, healing and reconciliation. Order is important, but also movement and flexibility, embracing change. Sources for inspiration from the seminarians were varied and even contradictory. They desired qualities ranging from the humility of St. Francis and the tenderness of Fra Angelico to the spiraling complexity of a Bach fugue. Weaving these strands would be part of the dance. The dance is realized in the building's free-flowing, unfolding gesture of connection, of reaching out into the world and conversely, drawing space into itself as protected precinct. The surfaces follow a swelling and a breathing of the inner space of the building. The basic pattern is the lemniscate, an architectural figure described by Goethe. Nothing's inside, nothing's outside, for what's inside is also outside, wholly open, secret. Mirroring the church itself, the building is animated by one curve and many views in a state of becoming, striving for wholeness. A stair is the fulcrum of the dance, and here, as we climb, shadow gathers, gravity resists, while simultaneously sunlight penetrates and light uplifts. In this space, the beauty and the silence of Estonian composer Arvo Pärt is evoked. In his words, this moment and eternity are struggling within us. A new contract is drawn between place, architecture, community, and spirit. One of my first Indigenous projects was a cultural centre in Budja Budja in Garryword, Hall's Gap in the Grampians. This was a collaboration with 5 Indigenous communities from the Western District. Communities still dealing with the intergenerational trauma of genocide, dispossession, and the stolen generation. The Brownback Project began with a gathering in the valley near the site under a starry autumn night sky, framed by the rocky ridges of Garryword. There was much feasting and drinking, laughing, dancing, and storytelling around a big campfire. It was late when I retreated to my tent, but there were still small groups talking. As the fire died in the darkness, I overheard stories of racism, abuse, and self-doubt, men weeping with inner pain and deep suffering. There was also the warmth of dry humour and courageous enduring together. I carried these resonant moments into the 18 months of collaborative workshops where we involved the design. The building, centered around a huge stone fireplace, embodied the stories and totems of the 5 communities. It also holds in its gestures of buckling and lifting, its arcs and shadows, a sense of both the burden of suffering and the energy of hope. Tragically, during the course of the project, 2 gifted young community members and collaborators, a painter and a stonemason, suicided. Tragedies like these point to the ongoing need to face the past and acknowledge the depth of the wounds. With damaged and dispossessed individuals and communities, to be listened to with respect and to hear each other may begin the healing process and contribute to a wider reconciliation in society at large. Right now, 32 years later, this building and its landscape is being reviewed, seeking evolution and rejuvenation to meet contemporary needs and to sense what the future is asking of this building and its communities. My experiences at the National Indigenous Knowledges Education Research Innovation Institute at Deakin University were different again. In this context, the Institute chose to rejuvenate an old building at the heart of the campus, rather than design a new building on the more peripheral site they'd been offered. The staff, students, and teachers sought spaces for walking and talking, for conversation and collaboration. Spaces that enabled these ways of meeting were balanced with gestures that recognized suffering and pain, such as the wounded and cut off tree, the trunk holding up a steel beam of the original structure, and also the supportive strength of traditional culture. At Uluru, the enormous monolith in Central Australia, my team and I stayed and worked with the Mutijulu Indigenous community for a month to collaborate on the design of a culture centre. An expression of the joint management of the Uluru Katajuda World Heritage National Park between Anangu, the people of the rock, and the rangers of the National Park and Wildlife Service. The centre celebrated a coming together of Western science and the wisdom of the oldest living culture on Earth. The challenge here was to create a building which was a weaving together of living, spiritual, and physical connections with Uluru, the sacred country, and its people and its stories. The tasks, responsibility, and risks of collaboration were significant. We needed to listen quietly and deeply, to sense into, to improvise, and to initiate creatively and in a timely way with Anangu and with the events, questions, and opportunities of each day as it unfolded. This required daily inner preparation, prayer, meditation, and attention to my inner state, to be awake, available to the challenges and synchronicities as they emerged. Tony Jamawa was a handsome, dignified man, both lawman and past Christian pastor, a warm, crusty man with a deeply observant intelligence. He wore a battered leather Stetson and spoke mostly in metaphors. Jamawa and a number of other Anangu elders were present at our first meeting, sitting around an aerial map of Uluru. This was our introduction to the Chukapa, the law. Anangu began to bring these stories to the meeting. Different aspects of the same stories were told by different individuals until the whole perimeter of the rock was alive with Chukapa events. Stories of Mala, the hair wallaby, Liru, the poisonous snake and his battle with Kunia, the carpet snake, and of Kopani, the evil dingo, were gradually pieced together. Personal biography and ancestral adventures wove together in a complex lattice of realities. This Uluru is not the one seen by tourists. Jamawa wanted us to know the difference between the Anangu relationship to the land and how Minga see it. Anangu described tourists as the white ants, or Minga, as they appear so tiny against the rock. Watching a tourist, he said, "That tourist comes here with a camera taking pictures all over. What has he got? Another photo to take home, keep part of Uluru for himself. He should get another lens, see straight inside. He wouldn't see Big Rock then. He would see that Kunia, the sacred carpet snake, living right inside there as from the beginning. He might throw his camera away then. Jamua later told us, you must listen with your heart. The knowledge is in the land. You just have to listen. It's always been there, and it always will be there. At one stage in the meetings, Jamua, who had been very friendly up to that point, suddenly fixed me with an intense glare. I experienced an extremely intrusive sensation in my head and heart region. I can only describe it as feeling like a powerful soul inspection. I told Jamua I didn't like what he was doing. At these words, he seemed to relax and withdraw his energy. The sensation inside me eased. On reflection, I realized that Jamua, as a guardian of the Chukapa, probably needed to ensure that I was true in heart and mind. He wanted to satisfy himself that he could entrust our team with the sensitive cultural information encoded in the Chukapa. After this experience, Jamua began to refer to me as Jilpi, meaning respected elder. I took this as a sign of his trust. I had passed his test. He announced after a number of Chukapa meetings in his metaphoric style, now all the stories are rounded up like horses and put in the yard. Talking about making building an Inma ceremony ground, the whole of the Mutijulu community talking to put it all together, make sure all given, nothing left out. We are still happy. Being happy, we are listening. You get it straight. You are inside. No words. He indicated that we were ready to begin the design process. Draw now, put it on paper. Make drawings. I can't wait to see it drawn on paper. Soon after, when we were walking the site with elder and artist Nellie Patterson, she began to talk passionately about the way the building needed to express Ananu and the ranges working together as one. In demonstrating this idea, she cupped each of her hands and curved them into one another like two interlocking arms of a spiral galaxy. This was a vital moment. Her gesture startled me as I had been exploring these same dancing shapes in my early morning drawings. I immediately sketched her gesture in the sand at our feet. This form became the leitmotif for the center as a whole. This gesture focused the shared process in a living picture, which became a seed for the unfolding design. The moment of recognition required presence and responsiveness, qualities of truly mindful and heartful modernism. The two spiraling arms hold the space between was a picture of not only the ranges and Ananu working together as one, but also of our collaborative process. The third space is here too, the middle space, where polarities meet, conflict, are reconciled and held in dynamic balance. Whether we see the arms as being Liru and Kunia, the two sacred serpents of Chukapa, indigenous and non-indigenous, new and old, inner and outer, spirit and matter, one and two, they are distinct and complementary, connected, yet one. I'd just like to finish with a poem which I think complements what we're talking about here and is a very contemporary, but also probably timeless, I think, expression of some of these things. It's by the Spanish poet Sofia de Mello Brainer Anderson. Portuguese, sorry, yeah. I listen, but I don't know if what I hear is silence or God. I listen without knowing if I'm hearing the resonance of empty plains or if an attentive consciousness from the limits of the universe deciphers and watches me. I just know that I go as the one who is seen and loved and known. And that is why in every gesture I place solemnity and risk. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Ron, would you like to begin your presentation now, and then we will have the dialogue afterwards?
Sure. I will share screen as well. Well, thank you very much for inviting me as well, and it was a wonderful presentation. I took some notes and look forward to the dialogue as well. So I'm going to talk briefly about my critique of modern mindfulness, but only briefly, and I plan on diverging into new territory that I think will be perhaps more resonant with some of Greg's creative process and spiritual development. So this is going to be interesting. So my inspiration for thinking about a more critical perspective on mindfulness came from the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is a American-born, Brooklyn, New York, ascetic, Theravadan monk, and one of the foremost English translators of the early Pali Canon Buddhist teachings. And he made this statement in an article he wrote, and it really stuck with me. Said, absent a sharp social critique, Buddhist practices could easily be used to justify and stabilize the status quo, becoming a reinforcement of consumer capitalism. And I think this came out around 2010. I can't really recall exactly, but I started really paying attention to what was going on in the modern mindfulness movement and how it really kind of became a burgeoning industry, especially because my background is as a management professor, a professor of management in the College of Business. When corporate mindfulness hit the scene, especially in Silicon Valley here, that's when I really began to take notice. So I saw a lot of sort of convergent threads intersecting, and that's sort of the impetus behind my interest in developing a critique. And I called that critique McMindfulness. McMindfulness is not a term that I coined. It actually comes from a psychologist and Buddhist practitioner in New York City, Miles Neal. But I ran with that term. It seemed to really be a cultural meme that was very descriptive of what was going on. And I'm going to make this very short. The way I would characterize the McMindfulness critique is three or four different sort of angles. One is how secular forms of mindfulness began to become decoupled from ethical frameworks and ethical context. and at the same time they were being commodified into a set of instrumental techniques that were being deployed in interesting contexts, such as corporations and even the U.S. military. And I began to see how these practices then were being used more for self-serving ends. And because they were void of this ethical framework and unmoored from a vision of the social good, they fit very easily into capitalist culture. And given that it became a 1.5 billion, I think it's 2 billion now, industry, kind of speaks to that. So what was going on here is that these applications, mindfulness techniques, were aimed to reduce the stress of individuals, but by psychologizing and privatizing social problems. And these applications really sort of emphasized self-regulation, personal control over emotions. But my main critique was aimed more at the ideological message behind these programs, because they placed the burden on individuals to accommodate and adapt to the status quo. And in some respects, the focus on self-regulation was leading to sort of a obsessive self-monitoring of one's inner states, leading to kind of like a social myopia of the political, economic, cultural context. And these techniques, these mindfulness techniques, became sort of subsumed under the broader wellness industry umbrella that was very dominant. So I mentioned the word accommodationist, and that comes right out of a book that also was very influential by Jeremy Carrott and Richard King, called Selling Spirituality, The Silent Takeover of Religion. And the way they characterized it really is that this privatized mindfulness was easily being co-opted and accommodated so that it was operating in a way to pacify feelings of anxiety at the individual level. And you saw that especially in corporations, where you could be working in a very toxic corporate culture, and mindfulness consultants would offer individual employees mindfulness training, but did nothing to actually address the real causes of workplace stressors. So, and I characterize this sort of as the latest iteration of a capitalist or corporatist spirituality. It's a colonization of mindfulness that had colonization of a spirituality that has a long historical tradition, which Carrott and King really did a great job. But their book came out before the mindfulness movement, so they were talking about how Zen was corporatized, or how Taoism was corporatized, and things like that. But the underlying point is that McMindfulness, or these mindfulness programs, were easily assimilated into existing corporate and institutional systems, and positioned these programs as kind of a salvic force that could help people cope with the noxious influences of capitalism. So by subordinating mindfulness to the economic realm, its potential for political and social transformation was neutered. Another way of characterizing this is to simply call it neoliberal mindfulness, or neoliberal spirituality. Yoga, Andrea Jain, who is a great scholar too at Indiana University, she talks about neoliberal spiritualities, but her focus is more on the commodification of yoga. But the basic rhetoric here with McMindfulness is that it subscribes to the ideological narrative of personal responsibility and resilience and that if we only retreated into our private selves to go inward and withdraw into our inner psychological worlds, then that's where we can find true happiness, authenticity, well-being, career success, whatever it may be. And this kind of reflects the whole privatization of spirituality then. And that's why you see mindfulness then sort of being seen as this do-it-yourself DIY private practice, especially when it's epitomized, for example, into a smartphone meditation app like Headspace or Calm. So mindfulness then is reframed as sort of this something that occurs only inside one's head, even more specific inside one's brain. And it's a very kind of neurocentric rhetoric that reinforces that mindfulness is a completely self-contained private practice for individuals, rather than being a practice that is socially embodied within a wider social, economic, political, historical context. And so it kind of reinforces an erasure of the social, you could say, fostering this kind of social amnesia. But that appeals to a very highly individualistic, entrepreneurial sort of ethos. And so that's about all I'm going to say about McMindfulness, because I think, well, I'll say a few more things. One of the issues here, and I'll talk about this more in general, about not the problem's not just with mindfulness, but actually with other forms of meditation too. But we'll stick with mindfulness for now. I call this the problem with I Spy Mindfulness. And so this is more phenomenological here. But often the practice of mindfulness amounts to spying on our own mind. We're asked to observe or to watch, like watch the breath. And it's almost like putting the FBI or the CIA on the case to kind of monitor what's going on. So we take the role of being the watcher, and we remind ourselves again and again, we have to be mindful, we have to be aware. We're giving ourselves kind of directions and instructions. And if we lose that opportunity, then we'll drift into mindlessness or get lost in thoughts and mental ruminations. We're not doing the practice right or correctly. So this kind of sets up almost like an inherent tension. It's keeping the mind on a very tight leash. And this reinforces a fundamental structure of dualism or a dichotomy. There's the subject who is meditating, and then there's the object of meditation. And it's that sort of dualism or that sort of tension that creates this feeling of separation. And this comes from a spiritual teacher, a Tibetan Lama by the name of Tarthang Tuku. This book is called Dimensions of Mind. I've been a student of Tarthang Tuku since 1982. And he's one of the first, I think I have a picture of him here. I'll jump to that. He is the first Tibetan Lama that came to the United States in 1968. First naturalized Tibetan Lama, and one of the few remaining living masters who was fully trained in Tibet. He lives in Northern California now at his monastery, which is architecturally quite an amazing place. It's called Odeon. But we'll get to that later. So let me come back to talking about this problem with mindfulness. Now, the title of this seminar, or the title of perhaps your program, is called Mindful Habitats, and I started really contemplating that quite a bit, just that terminology. And my slides are jumping here. So let's take those two words and sort of unpack them a bit. First of all, we have the word mindful, and obviously it comes from the root mind. But do we really know what mind is? And according to Tarsang Tuku, from his book Revelations of Mind, it says, normally we do not think to question how mind does its job. Now we would like to take a more active role to learn how mind designed the systems that have such significance for our lives and consider what modifications might work better for us today. And habitat. So the etymology of that is, as you can see, to live, inhabit, dwell. I live or dwell, habito. I live in, occupy, to have as a home. Also the word habit, conduct, the prevailing disposition or character of a person's thoughts and feelings. So, I started really kind of just free associating and these two words. And so I'd like to share with you some reflections. And it may not seem like it's exactly connected to this at first, but I can assure you I'll bring it back. So one question we can ask is, what is the quality of our habitats? How can we fully inhabit the spaces of our lives that promote harmony, balance, and well-being? Now, when I listened and watched Greg's beautiful, sort of almost like a visual memoir of his work, I feel like he was embodying this ideal right here. So that's a really important question, I think, here. Another very important question is, are we at home in our own minds? Just think about the feeling of restlessness that we have in our society today. Feeling of frustration, a feeling of alienation, estrangement, disenchantment, hopelessness. So that's a really important question as well. And how can we be mindful if we don't know what mind really is? So I'm already arguing that we don't know what mind really is, most of us. And so how can we be mindful if we really don't know what mind is? Here's a quote I'd like to read. We say that mind discriminates and judges. We say that mind alone knows, and that mind is responsible for identification, recognition, and decision making. English has more than 20 different ways that the word mind is used, and other languages may have yet other different meanings. Each individual adds to this complicated brew a set of private meanings and connotations. The proliferation of meanings and definitions testifies to the archaic origins of words we apply to mind and raises doubts that we truly understand what we mean by mind. We might wonder what deeper meanings have been lost through millennia of transmission, or ask what outmoded associations might be inhibiting a fresh perspective. So we have a lot of concepts, we have a lot of labels that we've inherited, but maybe those concepts and labels are actually obscuring having a fresh look. So I want to come back to the question when I asked, how can we fully inhabit the spaces of our lives? That's why I'd like to start with space. So, conventional space. What is a way of knowing conventional space? Well, for the most part, we understand the world by separating things out. That is, we establish identities, and that is how we develop ordinary knowledge that we rely on. The self takes a position of some kind. It establishes its location in time and space. It stakes a position saying, I am here, I am the subject, and I know objects. The basic duality of self and world. So we build a wall between me and the rest of the world, and between me and you. We establish a distance between in and out. And the world is out there, and I am in here. dividing up, we reject the fundamental unity of all that appears. You could see that in terms of the feelings of lack of space. People feel on a personal level how things are becoming crowded. Psychological pressure. Mental spaces are crowded, overwhelmed by the amount of information, digital information, the attention deficit that we have as a culture, the attention economy, so-called attention economy, where digital technologies of digital extraction are competing for our attention. But I think underlying this is that conventional space seems to be a way to separate and have distances between things. And in that sense, space in and of itself doesn't seem like it has any value, human value. Space itself, however, has nothing to do with distinctions and divisions. In the field of space, there are no borders and no distances. There are no opacities or boundaries that can define or locate in space. But our knowing capacities have been finely tuned, for good reasons, for evolutionary reasons, perhaps, to attend only to apparently solid things. And so space is just an empty container. It functions on a conventional level as just a vacuous, empty container for objects and things. And that's why I like to talk about this notion of focal settings. Because that conventional view of space is like a focal setting that as a culture we've kind of frozen this focal setting as the dominant way of knowing. So we like fish in water, we're not even aware that these focal settings are embodied in our psychophysical embodiment. So we need to become cognizant and aware of our focal setting and how they work, how they operate. So as I mentioned, I'm sort of repeating, but our conventional focal setting is that space merely makes room for objects. So therefore we seem to conclude that space is just a nothing. It's not more basic than objects. Objects are basic. So therefore it has no real value or significance for us. So coming back again to this notion of distinctions in space. If you really think about it, any distinction, any demarcation, any boundary, any contrast still depends on space. Even the ordinary nothing of space is a distinction in contrast to an object, and that is a something. So what is a distinction? Another distinction. Even the idea of a distinction is a distinction. So our conventional ways of knowing are bound to language and distinction making. Language is a vehicle, a human vehicle. It's a vehicle for cultural transmission. So we have, the body is a vehicle. Language is a unique vehicle, right? And then the mind is a vehicle. You could call these the three vehicles, the trilogy that we have to work with. But as I said, our focal settings seem to be frozen as a modern, maybe that's a modern characteristic of modernism. We're trained and conditioned to see things as distinctly separate. It's very difficult then to attend to space itself because we've already made the presumption that it has no value to begin with. So it's hard to track. It's not a thing. It's ungraspable because it's not an object. It has no solidity, has no opacity. So back to the conventional view. Objects exist. Physical space then amounts to a nothing, a vacuous container for objects. However, objects seem to depend on space, not the reverse. Space then, really, even on an ordinary level, appears to be fundamental to all perceptions and presences. Perception seems to emerge from what? So here we come back to the central importance of mind. The study of mind is a vital and important subject, for mind is our life and the basis for our reality. Its power is vast. Its radiance illumines every aspect of our being. Active in every moment of our lives, mind governs our way of experiencing and influences how we respond to all that it presents. Wherever something is acting, creating, and energizing, wherever something is expanding or contracting, wherever there is suffering or pleasure, mind is revealing its presence. There is nothing in our experience does not arise from mind, depend upon, and bear the imprint of mind. But we're sort of educated in Western modern culture. There's this taboo of subjectivity. We've never really been taught how to look directly and investigate mind. In fact, we've been sort of systematically well educated out of trusting our own subjectivity, our first-person experience. We need to understand and care for our own mind, but that way of being, that way of having an intimate partnership with our own mind, has been sort of marginalized in Western culture. But this endeavor that I'm talking about is not simply acquiring objective information about the mind or standing outside trying to look at it, nor does it necessarily involve meditation. So it's a different way of trying to develop a rapport with our own mind. Unfortunately, we're operating almost like Ouroboros. We're almost like caught in self-recursive loops of our own making. And that's because we're living in an unconscious story with the heroic ego, the heroic I as a deluded central actor. And that, I think, characterizes and defines the problem of living in an age of the Anthropocene. And what we're doing to nature is what we're actually doing to ourselves. And we're deluded in many respects by this view of naive realism, which is an interesting concept that comes out of philosophy of mind, is that we think it's natural that we look through our eyes much the same way that we look out a window, and that what we're really experiencing is reality out there as it is. And that's what's called naive realism. The idea is that we believe that what we actually see, reality as it is, for example, as it appears to us, is an accurate reflection. So, for example, if we look at a tree, it might seem that I'm experiencing the tree at a distance over there. But what I'm actually experiencing is mediated by mind. The data is being relayed by my senses and processed by my mind, which then creates an internal representation with a label and a concept attributed to a tree. So what I'm actually experiencing is a tree thought. Another example are colors. When I see a red chair, for example, we usually naively assume that the color red is inherent to the chair itself. We assume that the chair is actually red. But we know from cognitive neuroscience that's not the case at all. Instead, the surface of the chair has a particular property, and the way in which it reflects light, my brain is keeping track of through the mechanisms of perception. And redness is a subjective phenomena. So when I look at a red chair, the redness I experience depends on the properties of the chair, properties of what's going on in my neural networks. It all corresponds to the content of a set of perceptual predictions that I have about the ways in which a specific kind of surface reflects light. So there is no redness as such in the world. It's a subjective construction. So the larger claim I'd like to say here is that our entire experience of the so-called external world is a representation. Now, I'm not saying that external world doesn't exist, but I'm saying that the way we perceive it is not commonsensical. It's not a naive realism sort of view. Our entire experience of this so-called external world is a reconstruction, a representation, a recognition. One can say we're recognizing, which is mediated all by mind. Why it's so important to understand the operations of mind. But in a way, we don't understand the operations of mind. And when we don't understand the operations of mind, it operates as a regime. It's a regime. A regime is a useful metaphor because it signifies that our mind operates and functions as almost an all-powerful, encompassing enclosure that has specific rules that generates our known experience. And it operates in three main phases: perception or cognition, and then identification, and then again recognizing. And then there are feedback loops as well that are happening in that process. So mind is participating in this process as both the producer and the customer. So you could say it's the display maker and the display itself simultaneously. So going back to the idea of focal settings, when our focal settings are very narrow, it's difficult to see any other alternatives or possibilities. When we're so identified with a particular view, our awareness then is sort of crowded out. And the regime is then, operating quite automatically, quite reflexively. And we're recognizing, basically, the concepts of what we're perceiving, the concepts of what we're feeling. We're not really in touch intimately with the world. We're sort of recognizing that world. So we've lost a sense of sensitivity and intimacy with our surroundings. We're attending almost religiously to the proliferation of this meaning-making regime. And that meaning-making regime takes on almost an inexorable temporal momentum. And we become lost in a blur of meanings trying to keep up with information. And we see that with this sort of temporal acceleration now that we're due to digital technologies and so forth. And that drains us. Our energy gets sapped. We don't know what is urgent, what is important versus what's urgent. It draws out our attention. It scatters it, it fragments it, it dilutes it. And our potential for deeper knowing and sort of an embodied clarity is diminished. So I'd like to play this animation I made. And I barely know how to use software, so it's a bit amateurish, but I'd like to play it because I think it summarizes what I'm trying to say. So hopefully you'll be able to hear it. If not, we'll kill it. Let's review some of the main points here because we've been looking at regime of mind in terms of cognition, identification, and recognition, and how our sensory impressions are mediated by this regime of mind and turned into a known world with us as a knower. So let's take a look at some of these key elements and how they're related to each other because it's a very complex system in a way. And we have this notion of the I, obviously, which the heroic ego, which has a relationship to itself in a way, and we call that basically the me. And there's this back and forth between the I and the me and our sense of ownership, what's mine. And we see the whole world through that subjective perspective and stake a claim in a position and say, here I am, I'm here. So we have our five sense objects, our five sense consciousness, seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting. And of course, the mind is the sixth consciousness. And it's the intermediary, really. It's interpreting, it's judging, it's analyzing, it's categorizing. But our whole focal setting, a whole framework is coming into being with this split. And really, it's the grasping of our sensory inputs that takes hold and brings forth this whole framework. So let's take a little closer look at this operation of mind, because it's key to what we're trying to understand. So there's identification, identifying. We assign a name, a label, and a category to what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, or think. And then we recognize it, and it becomes part of an anchor of our memories, linking and a complex web of associations, which then feeds back, and almost like a self-perpetuating feedback loop. Can you see this? Can you observe this loop operating? Try to observe it. Now let's take a step back, because really that's the whole staging of our experience. There's kind of a staging of experience with that framework. And then boom, there's a position that's taken. And that position is taken up by the I, the heroic ego, the self as active agent who takes center stage and then sees a complete known world of things that it's embedded within, whether it's time, whether it's spatial relationships, whether it's conceptual knowledge. But this is the identity card that we carry around, and we think thoughts, and it's the whole sort of spatial temporal landscape that we live in within the regime of mind. Oh, good. I'm glad that worked. So we need to take a different approach. And normally we rely on our conceptual apparatus that mind makes available. Now the time has come to enter the inner realm of mind and understand how it operates on all levels of our being. But where might we find a point of entry to this realm? We would like to question mind directly, but mind seems reluctant to show itself. For all our methods of rational inquiry, for all our treasury of concepts and philosophical systems, it seems that we do not yet have the tools we need to explore the mysterious territory of our own minds. And we really cannot know anything outside our own mind. As I said, everything is mediated by mind. And that brings up this metaphor of camouflage. And I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's a snow leopard here in that photo. And that snow leopard is looking out at us. And the reason why camouflage works so well is that our knowing and visual capacity has been trained to look at borders. It's been trained to look at edges and demarcations. Well, in the case of camouflage, the object no longer stands out. So it blends in. It's hard to see the edges. And see, edges is what I was talking about earlier when I talked about the conventional view of space, is that we're conditioned to attend to things, demarcations, boundaries, borders, edges, which define how we make distinctions and point out something as existing, as standing out. So edges allow us to point out, allow us to perceptively select something. And our perception is designed to look at these edges, to discriminate, and then we grasp and identify it. So we cognize, we perceive, but then we point and we identify, that is a snow leopard. But it's hard to see the snow leopard right now, camouflage. So there it is. I don't know if you could see it. See its head there? Took me a while. So we need to look differently. And when we consider, the other point I want to make here about camouflage, very important point, is that in a way mind is camouflaged, but not in the same way that the snow leopard is. You see, if the mind has no edge, if the mind is omnipresent in our experience, it's perfectly camouflaged. It's totally transparent, it's clear. It's no wonder we have a hard time seeing it, because it's not an it. It's not an object of knowing. It's not an object of knowledge because you know, it's almost as if our whole perceptual experience is in the mind. Everything is pervaded by it. So it makes it extremely difficult to see by seeing it in a normal way of trying to look for something as a thing, as an object of knowing. So it's perfectly camouflaged, transparent maybe. So we have to come to a different way of looking. And when we consider the difficulties of understanding exactly what mind and what it does, when we attempt to look more closely at the structures that condition our knowledge of self and world, we begin to appreciate how little we really know. Despite pretenses to the contrary, at some level we sense the power of mind to override our intentions, dismiss our questions, and determine the outcome of every moment of our experience. Usually unacknowledged or brushed aside as we deal with the more immediate pressures of life, this sense that we must endure whatever mind presents is an ongoing source of insecurity and fear. So we need to take our minds seriously. If the I, the heroic ego, is not the master controller, as we've been led to believe, it seems we must rely on a deeper knowing. How can we cultivate and access such knowing? Well, first by admitting we aren't in control, perhaps as we thought we were, and we've been looking for knowledge in all the wrong places, or at least admit to our not knowing and lack of knowledge. And second, by tracing our mistakes, problems, and lack to not seeing clearly the operations of our own minds, and the hidden potential that is impeded by the automaticity of that regime. So, can we see and ask differently? Can we go beyond merely tweaking the contents within the regime of mind, such as self-improvement, mindfulness, therapy, adjustment? Can we develop a mindfulness, or better, a way of understanding that comes from outside of the self-referential system that is not governed by the regime of mind and its rules? Can we develop a thorough understanding of the operations of mind, a clear seeing of the mechanisms of mind? Can we do so? How can we do so when the seer, the one who claims to be the knower, is part of the regime's readout, part of the display? So that's what I have to share.
Thank you very much, Ron. What a wonderful presentation. What I think we can do now, as part of the discussion, maybe Ron, I'll just continue with you right now. Maybe if you could just reflect a little bit on what Greg had presented, and maybe could you just give me kind of a short synopsis of what you saw, from your perspective in Greg's work that might align with what you've been presenting?
Oh, yeah. I think when Greg first started out, and he talked about almost like these two tensions. One was how he was resisting the more conventional modernist approach to architecture. He was talking about his humanizing approach, where there was this sensitivity to kind of a living past and a living future, I think is the way you characterized it, versus this more reductive approach, where almost as if that past and future, or even the space for that matter, just became abstract indexes, almost like background mediums. In other words, they were dead. In other words, what was more important was the object to be created, not its relationship and its sensitivity to that temporal continuum that he was referring to, as well as the spatial context in which it was embedded. So I saw that as one, and connected that to this idea of the heroic ego, the I that stands out and takes a position, right? It dominates its surroundings as this sort of hero architect kind of archetype. To me, that was a parallel that really struck me.
Right.
And in a way, when Greg was talking about the paper he wrote, Towards the Architecture of Wholeness, it feels like almost this is a non-dual architecture, kind of a non-dual approach to architecture, where there's this kind of cultivation of intimacy with almost like a 360-degree sort of way of knowing, which takes into account the whole sort of field in which the construction of some sort of building is being developed, and that it's sort of a field of intimacy. And so that's initially what I resonated with the most. But I have more, so I'll start with that though.
Okay, perfect. I think maybe we'll bring Greg in, and Greg, I'll ask you the same question. What did you see in Ron's work that aligned with what you had presented and what you've been thinking about? I think you're muted right now, so if you just want to make sure that you're unmuted. Maybe just, Greg, what were your reflections on Ron's? Yes, yeah, we're good. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I was very struck by that description of space and objects, and space is nothing, objects exist and they're solid. Yeah. And I suppose I didn't develop some other things I was interested in, but space possible as something in becoming, rather than something just holds things or contains on space. So that, yeah, there's that. That was very powerful, those description of space and solid things and how we do. I suppose I'm also interested in the invisible, the energy of geomancy, or like at Uluru, I dowsed the position of all the spaces for the building in a kind of psychic conversation with the site. So this issue of boundaries that Ron was talking about too, as Jamawar talked about penetrating into the rock itself to find kunia. There's no boundary there of solidity of the rock. There's a psychic transparency and knowing possible. So I think it's wonderful, Ron, just opening up some of these questions for an architect too. There's a real reciprocity here that could enrich both, and the idea of architecture being a more enriched and complex holder of life, rather than that reduced thing where, as Ron said, it's dead. It's not about supporting our lives as human beings. It's about a look, which you might think you're in a magazine, or I don't know. And the whole consumer track. So the business of perception and what we assume is true and right. It's great to give it a good bashing as regularly as we can, I think.
I agree. There are several things that came out, I think, in both presentations that I maybe just want to kind of, connect both of you to talk about. One was the idea of this sort of the conditioning of the mind that Ron, you had brought up. And I think, Greg, in your presentation, you were talking about very early on, you're almost kind of being force indoctrinated, to be a Corbusian and, design, like a modernist. And it was not the mindset for you. You had to, rebel against it. You had to say, no, that's not how I want to define myself. And yet how you kind of, broke away from that and then began to kind of condition your mind. And then Ron's interpretation, of, the mind and kind of, our maybe current state or conditions, the maybe like, an unreflected mind, where we haven't really kind of looked at, what our mind is and how does it work? Can we actually ever know it? And then where and when do we begin this sort of conditioning? I wonder if maybe we could talk a little bit about, this sort of mindset. Maybe Greg, if you could talk a little bit about, why you decided not to be a true modernist at the time. Where did that lead you? And then maybe Ron, if you can maybe talk to a Greg's story about how he kind of had this sort of organic awareness, this sort of rising up through engagement with particular projects, particular people, about the definition of his mind, or maybe his subjective position. So Greg, maybe could you talk just a little bit about why you didn't want to be a modernist, and in the Corbusian sense, maybe?
Maybe it was a sense of feeling and heart. I suppose at the end of it, and I think Ron touched on this too, is I'm not interested in the building as an object. Well, I suppose I am in some way, but I'm more interested in the fact that a building can be a presence, a connected, living presence that actually is in conversation with people, place, spirit, and is enriched in a way that very little architecture is, with the belief that that's the case, that life is interconnected and a building can be a host or a conversationalist in the whole cosmos, And how do you do that? I suppose I became interested in ancient sacred geometries, for example, or certain means of ways of working which take into account the invisible and the ancient wisdoms. It's not just about modernism, but in education generally, the sacred mystical traditions are not really in the foreground, but they've got so much to give. I mean, they're verities, they're ongoing, abiding kind of truths. And this question of the mind, I think, has that question latent in it. There's the mind probably has been understood in ancient Indian culture, or to a certain extent anyway. And why don't we draw on that? It's not just about modernism, 20th century, or postmodernism, which we haven't talked about, or even post-human, which some people talk about too. So, so I've got off the point there. You did ask me a question.
I think you're giving us the answer that we're looking for. Yeah. Ron, did you want to maybe respond to what Greg's been saying?
Yeah. When you were talking about space and the invisible, it brought to mind the concept of focal settings that I was talking about earlier. I just heard an example. I was listening to an Audible book today by an Italian quantum physicist, The Order of Time, Carlo Rovelli. But he gave this example that at a distance you're looking at a cloud and above a mountain peak, and it's very kind of beautiful, and you could see the silvery edges very well, but if you imagine actually like being able to fly into the cloud, right? And you're in the cloud, and suddenly, what happened? What happened to the cloud, right? It's not there. It's not there in the sense of where are those edges? It's just kind of fog. And the point he was trying to get at, and I think, is that focal settings are emergent. They emerge depending on our point of view and what our interest is, what our interests are, right? What we value and what we attend to. And so Greg did not value that particular sort of tradition or that sort of conceptual approach. It went against his values. He had a different sort of way of valuing his art, his craft, and it gave him a different vision of reality that had a different sort of spatial temporal aesthetic, right? And so I think that there is a sort of a problem in our culture, and from an educational point of view, that we've been educated to really not consider the potential of human knowledge as a way of being in the world, which is not a way of being in the world which is not, leading to more and more human suffering, more imbalances, right? We don't have that sort of wisdom tradition, and that's problematic, I think.
It's interesting. The indigenous cultures or Aboriginal culture really very, very ephemeral so-called architecture, really just windbreaks and bows and spin effects. And really, we're not talking there about an enduring architecture. We're talking about a very expedient but very efficient and effective shelter when it's needed.
Mm. Mm.
And when you take away architecture, it gets back to what Ron was saying before. You take away the architecture, there's a sort of a livingness in the Aboriginal, the Indigenous relationship with the land and survival and ritual, how ritual comes to the fore. And what does that mean for, is there some kind of insight through ritual, or recreating rituals or new rituals, or how do we regain some of that rich interrelationship that the Indigenous people had with the land and each day, and their cycles and rhythms and the foods and the stars and their stories of morphing beings in the landscape. I suppose I'm taking this thread back to space and object. There seems to be something very rich there, I think, for me as an architect, but I think just as humans. And that's why I was trying not to divide in my talk our lives and our work as architects. They're really they're working off each other all the time. And what do we learn from one that can inform the other? And the same with education and philosophy and religion and spirituality generally. It has a place in education, but it's not really there most of the time. What's our worldview? Where does it come from? And how important is that for education and for our work? Obviously, Ron, yours has come together in your work and your spiritual path and your life have all come together, which is not a very common thing.
Well, yeah, I'd like to touch back to that notion of space again, because I think you're touching on the side, the quality of space as having this kind of accommodating quality, or this non-exhaustibility, you could say, in allowing. It's an allowing attitude that accommodates rather than blocks out. And so our ordinary way of seeing space, our conventional way of seeing space, again is almost non-existent, and its space is non-existent. It's a non-existent. It's a no thing. It's a nothing. It has no value to us. So it becomes instrumental, in sort of our modern way of approaching our lives and our cities or whatever we're doing, is that space is something that creates distance rather than something that connects. It serves in that instrumental sense.
It's a relational. It's a relational.
It's a relational, yeah. And so it has this. I mean, subject and object. The perception of subjects and objects is the product of a focal setting. It's a focal setting that has lived significance, because that's basically the dominant focal setting that has governed us primarily. That we have this strong sense of separation and between subjects, and objects have value, and space does not have value. So what that does is it sets up this kind of friction a field of friction, you could say, where there's only so much room available, and we're interested more in this this preservation of things. Like you said, it's the indigenous worldview is much more ephemeral, much more attuned to, you could say, the real nature of phenomena. Phenomena do not last. Things are always in flux and change, and there really are no things per se. There are only events that are related to each other. Various sorts of events. Even a mountain is sort of an event from a particular focal setting. A mountain didn't exist at one point in time. So everything is sort of, what happens is things become reified through language, and then we're not really in touch with phenomena. Instead, we are reconstructing or recognizing our basically our concepts are the intermediaries between us and the world. So we've lost a sense of liveliness and vividness and sensitivity to sort of the vitality of everything that is appearing around us and in us. The lively embodied quality of being alive has become sort of deadened. It's become kind of restricted and sort of consolidated into this kind of very limited sense of human embodiment, which then is sort of alienated from its surroundings in such a way that it looks for escape routes. It looks for ways to try to liven up its sense of being through stimulation and reaching out and grasping at this and grasping at that and consuming this product or this experience. It may be experiences, it may be objects, it may be power. And that sort of whole sort of friction, momentum of desire, which then feeds on itself through institutionalized suffering. That the media is kind of a form of suffering in a way that it sort of proliferates this sense of need and desire for us to consume. So in a way, we're consuming our own concepts, but our whole surroundings is just reinforcing that whole negative feedback loop, which is why we're in the situation we're in as a species, in terms of what we're seeing with this kind of runaway friction. And if you think about friction, it creates heat on the surface of the earth. And that heat is generating, literally, physically, heat in our atmosphere. And this is not something that, this is all sort of part of the regime of mind and how it operates on a collective level.
And Ron, if I may ask you at this point, that you're talking about this idea of nothingness, and definitely there are a lot of texts in Buddhist literature about nothingness. The idea that the world does not exist; it exists because we think about it in a certain way, and then through language that we start to develop concepts and perceive the world, this idea of nothingness. I'm not like super familiar with it, but where does this idea of the mind that you're talking about, the loop that you showed to us, does it have any hermeneutical or phenomenological background, or is it from your Buddhist associations that?
Well, yeah. First, let me just qualify that. I'm not making an ontological metaphysical claim that there isn't an external world. Just that our way of knowing it has always going to be mediated through mind. So I'm making more of an not an ontological, but an epistemology argument. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, so, but no, there's a vast literature on this, particularly Dharmakirti, who has a treatise on what he called valid cognition. And basically it was almost a precursor to modern cognitive neuroscience in terms of his understanding of the interaction between our senses and language construction. And it's very complex. It's beyond my pay grade, Dharmakirti. But and then there's the early tradition in Buddhism called the Abhidharma tradition, which is almost like a systematic, analytic, descriptive breakdown of perception, of consciousness, down to it's just incredible detail that there is no particular reducible self-existing thing, that everything is an event, everything is interrelated events that have no inherent existence. But that's, nothingness is not exactly the right term. It's, you could say, spaciousness or emptiness. There is no inherent self-existent thing in itself. Everything is dependent on other contingent relations. So there can be no particular self-being. There's nothing that can exist independently on its own in an absolute way. So that's why it's empty. It's empty of inherent existence. So it's not like there's nothingness. There's nothing, like nothing exists. No, there's all kinds of appearances, all kinds of phenomena occurring. It's just that what's the nature of those phenomena, right? Are they things that exist in and of themselves, independent from other things? No, that's a deluded view. Yeah.
Is the in Indian tradition, isn't space regarded as Brahma?
Mm-hmm.
Brahma.
Yeah, there's differences between the early Indian tradition and the Buddhist. There's some fundamental differences between them, but there are a lot of overlaps as well in that sense.
And I just also wanted to know, Ron, you're from management, and design management is a huge field, right, for architects. Greg.
Okay, yeah.
No, I'm just like trying to. It's a different trajectory that I wanted to probably take.
Yeah.
But this idea of management of when we are working on an architectural project, there's always the architect, a client, and there's management between. And Greg, when you were talking about these the projects, you talked about some of those stories and anecdotes that you talked about, where the architect as a human being evolves. And that helps evolve as an architect, and vice versa, I guess. How does the existence of these other players then start to change the architect as a human being as well? Because you come in contact with so many different people. For example, when you came in contact with the indigenous people, and there's always not talking in idealistic terms, but in commercial architectural practices, there is this idea of completing a project. The client is a very important player in that. And how does that start to interact when you think of you don't want to follow the norms. You don't want to do a project because it's supposed to be done this way, and it's dictated that it be done in a certain way. But there's also the client who's got a particular budget, a particular timeline. You're working with them, and how do you navigate between all these forces that are pulling you as an architect?
I suppose your architecture is a very grounding profession. If you can stuff up pretty badly and get into big trouble very quickly in terms of litigation or your reputation. I suppose, so that means you've got to be fairly prepared and thorough and have consultants that are very competent, because it's there's different stages of manifesting architecture. In the early stages, things are very fluid, and they suddenly start to close in on a point of grounding and money, and is everything as it should be. So it's largely about collaboration, the team with people who are covering all the different aspects. And I suppose there's a temperament that's important too, because there's rhythmic disappointments, and you don't get a job, you lose the competition. How you deal with that as a human being, how you deal with that as an architect. So I suppose it's up to the architect to surround themselves with who's needed, what are their particular skills, and what other skills do they need to complement. And also engaging the client, I think, in the vision. The client might bring the vision, but you've got to listen, and there's a kind of conversation, and then preferably everybody's on board.
It's an exhausting process, I guess.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, like the Uluru project I lived up there for a month, and then it took 5 years for the building to be funded and built. So it's a sort of a long haul sometimes.
I mean, management, Ron, definitely teaches us how to manage things to be within a timeline, within the budget and so on. But here you're asking us to rethink how we are being taught. I definitely love your proposition. I'm thinking, how do we do that while teaching? How do we, introduce such concepts that otherwise, we teach how do you make a timeline? What are the design processes? This phase comes first, then you go here. But it's all that conditioning that we are always doing as educators. How do we then unlearn?
Unlearn, yeah, it's a good word. I don't know. When Greg talked about working with the client and in kind of involving them and in the process, kind of co-creating a collaborative approach, it reminds me of a bit of jazz, like jazz. I've studied jazz. I was really interested in jazz as a metaphor for management or for leadership, maybe. And I actually worked with a jazz professor. We got a grant to work collaboratively, and we actually used. He's quite a virtuoso. He's a bebop player, but the more I looked at the jazz mindset, how jazz players think, but also how they operate together in an ensemble, I saw it had tremendous value in a way, because it's extremely adaptive to changing circumstances. I mean, improvisation is the nature of the beast. Is that you're open to the unknown. You're responsive to constant change in a creative way. But that's not to say that you throw out all the rules. Yet you don't have deliberate practice. That you don't have training in deep expertise. I mean, everybody who plays an instrument, whether it be a piano or the bass or saxophone, has spent years, studying transcripts of John Coltrane and practicing their scales, and so you have to do the work. But in terms of time, there seems to be a kind of a dynamic synchronization among jazz ensembles. There's kind of a synchronization that comes into play, and I think that they're all kind of interactive variables that happen simultaneously, and I call that the jazz mindset. And one of the competencies is attentive virtuosity, this deep listening to what others are doing, and letting that become a feedback loop for your sort of response. It's kind of a mutual feedback loop between all the players in a project. So to me, that's a unique art form because it's extremely collaborative. And if one person tries to be the star and doesn't respond, appropriately, then the whole band will sound poor. It won't. And if you rely too much on routine and habit, it's not going to be very interesting. It's not going to be jazz. It's not going to be improvisational. So if you take too many risks, and if you go too far out in the risk land, and then people will kind of lose you in some ways.
It falls apart, yeah.
Yeah. So to me, it sounds like Greg's approach is a bit like jazz in a sense.
I've used in dance. I've used dance as a metaphor too. There's and at Uluru, the synchronicity of things was extraordinary over that month. So that you have to be awake actually to connect up, and the jazz ensemble is a fantastic metaphor too. The reality of it, to let go into that sort of space, trusting other people, these principles. And I'm be curious to know what you did with some of the principles. Do they come into your work then, or?
We made there's a video on YouTube that we made that summarized these principles, so I could give you that link later.
That'd be terrific.
I wrote a couple articles on that too, about the jazz metaphor, its implications for team learning.
Well, so there's issues there of the inner state of working in that way. You have to have a degree of openness, but also containment. You've got to be listening, the feedback thing, and some sort of joy or life force that gives over to that the middle space or the common space.
Yeah, in fact, I think you're describing what we call the creative tensions between these so-called opposites. So habit versus spontaneity, or routine versus risk, or so it's balancing. It's kind of a dynamic balancing act between managing these creative tensions that are happening in real time. Too much openness, you'll lose your sense of self. Too much risk, you go off the chart, so to speak. So it's a work versus play, joy, the joy of play, but it's also work. So it's kind of it's a blending, not a blending, but a sort of optimization of these creative tensions.
Very fascinating. I want to be mindful of the time.
Oh,
No
one more
pun
thing
intended.
about the project
Oh, go
timeline.
ahead.
I'll say one more thing is that one thing about time is that I've always been just the word deadline to me is interesting as a metaphor. Is that
Mm.
what is that? How is that tied up with our sense of vulnerability? Because we assign a deadline. What happens if you don't meet the deadline? It's almost like a firing squad is waiting for you, or what is it? So it's almost like our language itself sort of has some sort of effect on our perception of time. But I mean, one way of thinking about a distant goal in the future, instead of calling it a deadline, but is to reverse the momentum of of time. In other words, to see that future point in time and look back to where you are now, kind of as an exercise. So like temporal reversal. That time is kind of an emergent construct that's part of our mental agreement that we share on a consensus level, this linear temporal structure of time, which seems to have a past, present, future momentum to it. That may also be a construction that is very persuasive, and we might be able to play with that just like jazz can play with different sorts of tunes and turn them into something else that's a little more interesting. We may be able to play with our constructs of time in a way that we're not slaves of those constructs. But
Yeah,
still honoring the fact that there are points in time on a conventional level. But we may be much more effective in operating in that realm of conventional time because we're not buying into those constructs in a way that where our whole sense of self-esteem or a sense of self is going to be threatened by it.
I think that there's I can think of my experience of two kinds of time in a way. One being the deadline, which the pressure and the tension, in a sense, crank up the energy creatively. So, and I've used that constructively at times, but it seems like if you step away from it, it's not so very healthy thing, but it has its uses, which I've experienced really in a short space of time. You can get something out that's sort of coherent. And the other one is when you're working in the zone, as some say jazz musicians are sometimes, or we have the experience, I've felt the time doesn't matter, somehow it disappears. And you might have only spent 10 minutes, but it's been like a day from what you've been able to draw together. So yeah, time's a strange one that what's in the mind and what's the nature of time, especially creatively, and what's synchronicity. And a lot of these things are underlooked into in a way as to what's really going on. The old habits sort of tend to strangle our capacity to loosen and reconstellate.
Yep.
Fascinating stuff. I think we're reaching past our 2-hour limit. I think you guys definitely had a conversation going that we didn't want to disrupt, but we also have to be, again, I think, mindful of everybody's time and your time as well, too. So what I'd like to do is I'd just like to bring the discussion to a close. And if you had any just last comments or anything you wanted to say before we end. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, Pallavi. I didn't see any. But if anybody had a question, we could kind of hang on and answer that afterwards. But any closing remarks from either of you?
Just if anyone has a question, if you raise your hand, I can allow you to talk. You don't have to chat. Put it in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. Just raise your hand. There's a raise hand button, hopefully, on your screens at the bottom. If not, just put it in the chat and I'll allow you to talk. There's a button here. I mean, I'm no one to allow you to talk. I meant there is a function here through which I get you on.
Okay, Greg, did you have any closing remarks for today?
Oh, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and yeah, to get together too, another framework for discussion. The framework for discussion is really interesting, I think, and I thank you all for the invitation, and really enjoyed it.
Thank you for participating, Ron.
Same here. I really enjoyed your presentation, Greg, and I was just astounded by your work. I wasn't aware, I'm not an architect, and interesting. I'll say one more point that my friend told me about this the other day, that some of the early studies on creativity, a study of creative individuals, was done on architects, and there's a book that's on the creativity of architects that my friend showed me the other day. Frank Barron, who psychologist, the late Frank Barron, did most of this work in the early days at the Institute for Personality and Assessment Research at UC Berkeley. So I thought that might, when I was listening to Greg today about his process, a lot of that stuff is, a lot of your personality orientation is hitting all the check marks here of high levels of individual creativity. There's no doubt. And so I really appreciated it, and I really appreciated the invitation and to be, talking to completely different discipline. It's so exciting because management is kind of boring to me.
That's why we did it, Ron. We just wanted to spice up your life a little bit.
Actually, maybe I could there was a conclusion. I didn't speak for my talk, so maybe I could just read. It's only a minute, but
yes,
I forgot.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this was supposed to go just before the poem. For me, instances of presence and recognition have been seed points for the future. Writing those stream of consciousness pages I put on display in the Four Architects exhibition, gathering and integrating into a building the qualities aspired to by the theological seminarians, listening to the stories of tragedy and courage around the fire at Brownback, and experiencing Tony Jamawa's soul interrogation, or recognizing Nellie Patterson's gesture at Uluru. Every project has a defining moment which requires recognition, connection, response, and embodiment, a true mindful modernism. For me, these moments of risk, synchronicity, and intuition bear witness to the living presence of body, soul, and spirit, which can live in the process and manifestation of a building. Sorry, that was the end bit for my talk. Get it in, better late than never.
Yeah.
That's right. It's actually a great way to end, actually. That's a wonderful quote. Thank you. So I would like to thank Greg and Ron for participating in this session, and thanks to everybody who was attending today. I think we had a wonderful discussion. We learned a lot of new things, and a lot of new things were brought to the surface. Definitely for me, new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching design thinking, and then also stepping outside of design and thinking about other aspects that are related to design. And I think that's what these sessions are all about. Just a little plug for next week. So on Saturday, January 22nd will be our next session, which is entitled Against Representation. And we have Perry Culper and Neil Spiller, and they will be talking about representation in design and mindful representation. So I hope you can all attend at that time, and that will be at 10 o'clock Eastern time. So no more dinner time presentations. next week, but we're definitely very thankful again. Thank you so much, Greg and Ron, for participating and having a wonderful discussion. Thank you all. And with that, I would just like to say thanks to everybody, and we'll conclude the session for today. Thanks for all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Greg. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been
Thank you.
wonderful. Thanks.